I work as a part-time contractor, specializing in flooring. It's good, fulfilling work for the most part. I learned the trade from my cousin, and it supplements my day trading income. I've been doing it for a few years now, and while I enjoy it, I'm sure my work stories would bore the average person. That was until a few months ago. I had a job just on the outskirts of town, a large but pretty old house that had recently been bought by new owners that wanted to renovate the basement, which had never been fully finished by the previous guy who owned it. We had been working for a while, and things were going pretty normally. We were working to remove the previously decrepit flooring. I was chiseling in the far corner of the room when suddenly the ground under me just kind of collapsed. Before I even knew what was happening, I was splayed out in the dark, pain screeching across my body as my head pounded. I was covered in debris and laid out stunned, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. One of the other contractors peered over the edge at me, asking if I was all right. He was roughly 3 feet above me, looking down into the hole. I slowly sat up, and while I was pretty torn up, I wasn't seriously injured or anything. I told him I was all right and had a look around. I noticed I was in some kind of tunnel. To my right and left, the dirt path drifted off into the darkness. After I'd been pulled out and cleaned up a little, I told the other workers what I had seen. As far as we knew from the blueprints of the house, there was no underground chambers or anything under the basement we should have been aware of, other than the usual plumbing and electrical stuff. We halted the job and contacted the previous owner, who knew nothing about any tunnels below the house. We filed a report with the city, given that we were literally out of our depth and had no idea how to approach a situation. They told us they'd investigate, and for the time being, we weren't to continue work on the property. A few days later, we were contacted and told that because of the danger of the site, the new owners had been compensated, and the city had taken ownership of the property and condemned it. We were paid for our work, plus a little extra for the trouble, and that was that. The other guys were content, but I have to admit my curiosity was piqued. Like I said, this field isn't exactly known for excitement outside of the industry, but nothing like this had ever happened to me or anyone else I knew. I mean, secret underground tunnels, that's the stuff that a good mystery's made out of. I decided to talk about it to the local paper, and at the very least, I thought it could give me a minute or two in the spotlight. Who doesn't want to be on the news, right? I met with one of the journalists and told my story. She grabbed some pictures of my scabs and told me I was almost guaranteed to be featured. It's a small town, and not much happens around here. I figured I'd at least get a blurb on their online publication or something. Instead, the next day I got an email from them saying that unfortunately they had to reject my submission. I was a little stung, honestly, but I didn't take it too harshly. Not like it was going to be life-changing or anything like that. It wasn't a half hour later that I received a knock on my door. I opened the door to a short but well-built man. He was wearing a fairly plain button-up, a jacket, and some jeans, nothing out of the ordinary. He asked if he could come in, and he said he was from the city. I agreed, and we went and sat in my living room. I'll make this short. I don't want to waste your time. The city is asking you to keep the incident at the property in Hillside to yourself. We're investigating things thoroughly, and we do not want to cause any alarm to residents or attract any vandals or urban explorers. I was taken aback, since while I was curious, I didn't think it was as big a deal as all that. I agreed nonetheless, not wanting any real trouble. I did let him know that I'd contacted the local paper, but they rejected my story anyway. "We know," he said, and his cordial demeanor turned suddenly grim. He stood up and turned ever so slightly so I could get a look at the holstered gun on his hip. "Don't do that again. Are we clear?" My blood ran cold, and I affirmed that we were. He nodded and told me to have a good day before he left. I was stunned. I didn't know what the hell had just happened. As I was reasoning through things, I figured no legitimate city personnel would threaten me with a gun. I mean, he wasn't a cop, but who would care so much about this, or even know about it? How did they know I was talking to a journalist? Over the next few days, it ate me up. Apparently the other guys had similar experiences with someone from the city, though not as drastic as mine. Most of them figured we had run into something we shouldn't have, and we should just leave it alone. One, though, Raphael, seemed even more interested than I was. I'd worked with him on a few projects before, and he was a little quirky, to say the least. He called me privately and proposed that we investigate the site ourselves. I turned him down. After all, someone had enough interest in the situation to follow me and flash me his gun, supposedly on behalf of the city. Raph said that he would go with or without somebody, but I told him even if I wanted to go with him, there was no way we could go back into it. The house, I'm sure, was being watched, and city workers were taking care of the tunnels. Wasn't like we were equipped to go excavating all over the area the house was on. He dropped in for a while, confronting me with sound logic. It was only a few days later that he sent me a picture of an open hole taken at some hill. Found this kind of close. Going to investigate. Text you when I'm out, the message read. A pit grew in my stomach. Surely whatever was going on was far above our heads, and he was taking a big risk being nosy. I figured he'd get caught, and I'd get another visit asking if I knew about what he was doing. Part of me also worried that he would get physically hurt, though, or even lost. What if they sealed him up in there? Or what if a tunnel collapsed? My fear grew over the next few days as I didn't hear anything from him. I began to worry more and more, and I thought about calling the police, but there was that curiosity creeping back in. Morbid, gnawing curiosity. Strange sense that the police in this situation would not be my friends. I figured I should at least find the spot he went to let the authorities know, you know. Early the next morning, I drove out to the area. There were quite a few hiking trails, so I gathered and started on one of those as I made my way around until I found the hole. My heart dropped when I saw his car parked in one of the lots, with 3 tickets piled mindlessly on the windshield. I started on the closest path, trying to find the spot he had sent a picture from. It was clear from his photo that he'd gone off trail, but I was hoping to at least get an idea of where exactly he'd headed. After roughly 20 minutes of wandering around, I saw a hill that looked like it could be it in the distance. I made for it as quickly as possible, sweating up a storm. I cursed the fact that I'd only brought a single bottle of water as I slammed it down my dry throat. Eventually, I reached the hill and began to circle it. It didn't take me long to find the hole. I froze at its entrance, staring down at it. It was roughly the height of the chamber that I'd landed in when I originally had my accident. Call the police, I told myself, but I didn't. The gaping maw in front of me seemed to pull me in. Why I climbed in, I couldn't tell you. Fear for Raph, knowing a minute wasted could be the difference between life and death. Fear of what would happen to me if the authorities got involved. And a rational desire to uncover the truth all by myself. Whatever the reason, I climbed in and started down the slowly dropping shaft. I hadn't prepared at all. I had my phone flashlight, which poorly illuminated the chamber. I slowly inched my way down, stopping every now and again to listen for anything. All I could hear was my own breathing. I continued before calling out, "Raph, it's me! Raph, you down here?" No reply. I knew this had to be a long tunnel, impossibly long. The house was a solid 3-minute drive from the recreational area. That might not sound like much, but when you're crawling in a tunnel, it sure as hell is. I resolved that if I didn't find any trace of him in the next few minutes, I would turn around and bite the bullet with the cops. Not long after that, I saw an opening in the wall. It was another tunnel, shooting down left. Right next to the new hole, I saw something etched in the dirt, a crude arrow pointing up, and some letters next to it. They were pretty hard to read, and I pressed my face and phone light real close. The scrawlings were faint and jagged, but this is what I could make out. In something ST1 something. I pondered for a second on what it might mean. Was it graffiti? I hadn't even noticed something was now in the opening. A rat's face peeking out of the darkness. I jumped back and yelped, slamming into the chamber wall. I caught my breath. I've seen a few rats in my day, and I've never really been scared of them. I shined the light at it, ready to tell it to go away. My stomach dropped, and my adrenaline flooded my body a second time. It wasn't a rat. It was rat-like, covered in fur and whiskers, with huge ears and a protruding snout. But it was nearly man-sized. It wore a ragged vest and tattered camo pants. In one hand it held a rusted revolver, pointed straight at me. Between its teeth, it clenched a long blade. I said nothing. I was paralyzed with fear, but its free hand had begun to motion me to come closer, and it turned to point down the chamber. I saw a long, fleshy tail below its legs as it shifted. It pulled the knife from its mouth and began to speak at me. It was at once guttural and squeaky, but it was clearly English. "Come, I bring you to Major." I began to stammer, protesting and putting my hands up, my phone light clattering to the ground and shining up. No, I'm sorry, I'll leave, please." As I pleaded, it began to inch towards me, nostrils flaring. In retrospect, it must have wanted me alive. Otherwise, it would have just shot me. I heard something coming down the way I had come. Glancing, I saw another shape inching towards me. I thought it might be a second one of them. Suddenly, a bright beam of light flooded the chamber, and I shielded my eyes. The creature let out a terrible shriek, and I could hear the sound of scurrying. A deafening boom followed a gunshot, which my ears had yet to recover from. I felt hands grab me and pull me back up the tunnel a ways. I looked up and saw it was a human man. He let go of me for a second, and with great speed, he withdrew, primed, and threw a canister down the tunnel, which started spewing some sort of gas. Instantly my eyes began to sting, and he screamed at me to follow him out, roughly pulling me forward. I crawled blindly after him, repeatedly scraping myself and hitting my head in a panic. Eventually we burst out of the tunnel and into the sun. I laid sprawled on the ground, everything in pain. My eyes, my ears, my lungs, my hands, my knees. They were all searing. Through blurred eyes, I saw the man intently looking down the chamber, a pistol of his own pointed down. I recognized him as the man from the city that had threatened me at the start of all this. After what seemed like forever, he put the gun away and came to me. He asked if I was injured, and I shook my head. He helped me up, and we walked a ways from the opening, but also away from the trail. He sat me down and began to yell. "I thought I was clear that you were going to drop it," he said, burying his face in his hands. "I messed up. I should have trailed you longer. I thought you were done with this." I said nothing, and he turned to me with an intense look on his face. "Why were you out here? And who knew you were here?" My friend, my work buddy, Raph, he went down there. I hadn't heard from him. He worked with me at the job." His face went pale. "He went down there?" I thought that guy was going to be less problematic. This is bad. This is really bad. He took a deep breath, and after a moment of collecting himself, he spoke. "Forget about him. Forget you ever knew him. No, to hell with that. I'm already screwed. My superiors are going to crucify me. I'll tell you this. Forget everything. Your job, your apartment, anything you have here. Get the hell out of the country, and don't tell anyone where you're going, because I'm sure I'll have to testify. Don't ever speak of what you saw. I'm not saying this to cover my ass. I'm as good as dead, but if you want any chance of having a normal life after this, go somewhere quiet, start fresh, leave this all behind you, and do it quick." He stopped talking and pulled out a radio. He fiercely pointed towards the trail, and I didn't hesitate. I went all the way back, hopping into my car, and drove straight home. I sat for a while, stunned, before slowly grabbing some important things. My cousin Dave had a place down in Mexico, a majority of the year. Although I lost my personal phone, I still had my work phone, and I got a hold of him. I didn't tell him much, just that I was in trouble, and I needed to get down there as quickly as possible to figure out my situation. After he verified that I hadn't killed anyone or anything like that, he agreed to help me make arrangements to get out of here. I won't go into much detail, but I more or less fled without a word, taking only money and my passport, alongside some clothes and stuff. I eventually got down to his place, a quiet little spot in a small resort town. He put me up for a while and also helped me make a game plan for my next move. Of course, he wanted to hear what happened. I told him everything over a couple of drinks. When I finished, he swished the glass for a second, thinking hard. "You remember my dad, right?" he eventually asked. I nodded. I hadn't known my uncle too well, and he had a reputation in the family for being kind of a kook and a recluse. He'd been in the Army during the Vietnam War, being dishonorably discharged, got into a lot of conspiracy nonsense, and ended up being divorced by my aunt when I was young. He more or less disappeared after that. Really never saw his kids or anyone else in the family. You see, my dad, most of the stuff he got into was crackpot garbage, but there was one thing he always raved about that he swore he had personally seen evidence of. You know, the abandoned factory outside the city. Everyone in the area did. It was no secret for locals that in the 60s, the U.S. Army had requisitioned the facility as a testing ground for demolitions, and after the Vietnam War, they packed up and left it abandoned. My uncle had been a desk jockey at the facility and was discharged for mentally unstable behavior. Dad was convinced that there was more than demolition going on out there when he was in the Army. He claimed that he did some snooping around and discovered that the demolition thing was a cover-up for secret projects. He took a deep breath and laughed, a little shaky in his face. "This is going to sound silly. Actually, no, it's not. Not after what you told me." He thought they were trying to breed some kind of super soldier there to use in Nam. He was part of logistics and said they were always discreetly bringing in all kinds of lab equipment alongside the normal stuff. There was one shipment he caught a glimpse of, and he said there was a bunch of pet supplies for rats. He got this idea that the Army was attempting to splice rodent DNA into troops. You know, because of all the Viet Cong tunnel systems and the tunnel rats. He thought they were trying to take it a step further, literally making soldiers with rat DNA to infiltrate the tunnels. The story was that when he tried to bring things up, they dismissed him, till he attempted to expose things himself and got himself caught and discharged on a faulty psychological ground. Given how he was, we always figured he was kind of crazy, and that they were probably in the right. We both sat in silence for a little while, and I strangely started to laugh. Guess he wasn't so crazy after all, then. Once I got set up, things were okay for a while. I found ways to apply my skill set to my new area and work jobs to get by. No government men came after me, and I had more or less made it out, free and clear. Why am I posting then? Well, I'm not sure. Just like my decision to enter the tunnels, it's undercut by that lingering sense of curiosity. I can't say I want to be found, but I almost do. It's lonely, and I've got no one to share this experience with out here. I'm wondering what all ended up happening. My life is kind of dead end now, working just to pay for the basics. How do you go back to normalcy after something like that? I'm sure this will end up across somebody's radar. I don't know if I'll end up with a bullet in my head in the middle of the night, or me taken to some kind of secret interrogation facility or what, but I feel compelled to share, and I accept whatever fate is coming my way. The small town of Ravenwood was plagued by a terrifying creature, known as the Dogman. It was said to be a creature that was half man, half dog, with glowing red eyes and razor-sharp teeth. It was a creature of legend, but the people of Ravenwood knew it was all too real. It had been attacking and killing their livestock for months, and the town was in a state of crippling fear. The citizens couldn't go one night without hearing the next dawn of one of their own picked away in the night. Who among them, they always wondered, could stand against such a terrifying scourge? The beast, this dog man, he'd proven to be too much for even the police to handle. That is until one man decided to stand up from the crowd. Jack, a young man known for his bravery and hunting skills, decided that he was going to put an end to this, but he couldn't go alone. He gathered a team of the best hunters he could find in town, far and wide, and they set out into the woods to hunt the dog man. As they entered the wood, the atmosphere was eerie, and the air was thick with tension. On all sides, the trees around them were thick, close together, boxing them in. Looking around, each and every one of them knew that they were not going to get out of this forest. There was no turning back. Only they or the dog man would leave alive. They knew they were facing an extremely dangerous creature, and they were aware that this may be their very last hunt. They set up camp and began to track the dogmen. They searched for days, but it was as if the creature had vanished into thin air. One night, as they sat around the campfire, discussing their next move, they heard a blood-curdling howl in the forest. They knew they had found their target, but where? That sent a chill down their spine. They quickly packed up the camp and set out to track the howl. As they followed the howl deeper into the woods, the trees grew thicker and the darkness more intense, but they knew they were getting close. Suddenly they came across a clearing, and in the center of the clearing stood the beast. It was even more terrifying than the legends had described. It stood on its hind legs, towering over the hunters, and its glowing red eyes locked onto its prey. Each of the men stood, despite each of them being hardened men who had seen the likes of the vile and rabid game. They had never before seen something so terrifying, so gargantuan, so tyrannical as the dog man that stood before them now. They could feel, each of them, this thing's burning red eyes peering straight through their corneas, straight through their brains, into their hearts. "That's it," said Jack, his heart pounding in his chest. "That's the dog man." The hunters raised their weapons and prepared to fire, but the dog man was too fast. With lightning speed it charged at them, its razor-sharp teeth bared, ready to rend flesh from bone. The hunters fired, but their bullets seemed to have no effect on the creature. "We have to take it down," Jack shouted. The hunters fought bravely, but they were no match for the dog man. It was far too strong, far too fast, and just far too ferocious. Jack was thrown to the ground, and he thought that it was the end of him. He watched as two of his other companions were slammed into a tree, instantly crushing their skulls to paste. The third, Jack watched in horror as the dog man lifted the poor bastard by the head and ripped it clean from its shoulders, dousing them both in warm metallic crimson. Jack had all but given up hope. There was nothing he could do. The men were dead, and the dogmen would have him next. The dogman approached, the ground shaking with fear of every step. Snarling, he opened his mouth. Suddenly, Jack remembered something his grandfather had told him. He remembered the legend of the dogman and how it may be defeated, for, like many creatures of native lore, they all bore a very distinct weakness to silver. With a surge of strength, Jack rose to his feet and pulled out his silver knife. The dogman turned to face him, snarling defiantly, and Jack plunged the blade into his heart with a furious roar. The creature let out a blood-curdling howl and fell to the ground, dead. Jack stood, adrenaline forcing his heart to thump and pound in his chest, harder than it had ever before. "We did it," Jack said, his voice shaking with emotion. "The town is saved." He returned to Ravenwood as a hero. He was greeted with cheers and congratulations from the townspeople. Jack went to see the mayor to report what had happened. "Jack! Oh God, Jack, I can't thank you enough," the mayor said, a look of relief plastered on his face. The dog man had been terrorizing our town for so long. You've saved us all." "It was my pleasure, sir," Jack replied, "but I couldn't have done it without the help of my men. God rest their souls." The mayor nodded. "You're right. This is a team effort. They were brave men who gave their lives, and I want to make sure that everyone is recognized for their bravery. I'll be holding a town meeting tomorrow to present medals of honor to you and holding a memorial for the rest of your team." Jack couldn't believe it. He had never thought of himself as a hero, but to the town, he now was. He felt a sense of pride and accomplishment wash over him. But their victory was short-lived. They soon realized that the dog man was not the only creature terrorizing the town. The legend of the werewolf was also true, and it had been seen recently in the forest. Jack knew that he would have to act fast before it did any real harm to the town. He set out again into the forest to hunt the werewolf. This time he was better prepared, and he had silver bullets on hand for when he inevitably came face to face with the beast. He searched for days, but the werewolf was elusive. The werewolf was far more agile than the dogman before him. One night, as he sat around the campfire, pondering his next move, when a blood-curdling howl echoed through the woods, just as the dogman's had. It was even more terrifying than anything he'd ever heard. It was a howl that even would have given the dogman pause. And before he knew what was happening, its eyes, its burning yellow eyes, were fixed upon his. The young hunter, the hero, raised his weapon and fired, but the werewolf was far too fast, bounding from treetop to treetop. From one, it bounded like a panther towards the other, with its teeth and claws bared. He fired his silver bullets. After a few, perhaps 3 or 4 misfires, his aim came true, and the werewolf let out a final howl before crashing to the ground dead. Jack felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had finally put an end to another terror that had plagued the town. He looked at it and looked back towards the town, imagining the same relief in the eyes of the townspeople. He had done it once again. And as he made his way back to town, he was again greeted as a hero. The town threw a huge celebration in his honor, and once more the mayor presented him with a medal. Jack felt a sense of pride and accomplishment, but as he looked back towards the townspeople, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. He knew that this wasn't the end. There would be other monsters out there, lurking, and other battles that he would have to fight. But for now, he was content to bask in the glory of his victory. As the days went by, Jack became known as the monster hunter of Ravenwood. He was called upon whenever there was any kind of creature, any kind of behemoth monstrosity terrorizing the town, and he always answered the call, ready to face whatever gargantuan plagued the city. In the years to follow, Jack faced many challenges, but he would always emerge the victor. He became a legend in his own right, and his name was passed down through many glorious generations of the town. But for Jack, it was never about the glory or the fame. It was about protecting the innocent and keeping his community safe. And that was a duty he would always be willing to undertake, no matter the cost. And so, Jack continued to hunt monsters, his courage and determination never faltering, always ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. I will never tell my parents how my grandparents really died. They wouldn't believe me if I did anyway. You may not either. About a month ago, I had just gotten out of class when I checked my phone. To my surprise, it was a voicemail from my father. Sure, Mom would call me from time to time since I left for college, but when I saw that my dad had called, I knew it was bad news. I just didn't know how bad at the time. "Son, we're buying you a plane ticket. You need to fly home right away. There's been an incident. Call me when you get this." That was all the voicemail said. I called them, and he explained that my grandfather had been killed in an accident with a combine while harvesting his corn. That the shock had killed my grandmother and caused her to have a heart attack as well. The flight was nerve-wracking. I've never done well in small spaces. I couldn't smoke on the flight, which made it even worse. I spent the whole flight fidgeting and walking back and forth to the restroom, even though I didn't need to go. I just needed to move around. My dad was already waiting for me when I landed, which ruined my plans of sneaking a cigarette before he showed. He gave me a hug and helped me load my bags in the car. I decided I needed a cigarette bad enough to light one up in the parking garage. My dad had never seen me smoke, and I tried to act as casual as I could about it. He raised an eyebrow as he closed the trunk. I waited for a lecture or an outburst, but all he said was, "That's a nice lighter." I hadn't realized I was still fidgeting with it. I handed him the vintage trench lighter. Ellen, my girlfriend, bought it for me a few weeks ago. Found it at an antique store in Seattle. He took it in his hand and looked at it approvingly. Then he handed it back. "No smoking in the car. Your mother'd never let us hear the end of it." My headache was gone by then, and I had a sufficient amount of nicotine in my system. I threw the cigarette down and stomped on it with my foot. An hour later, we were back at my parents' house, my mother greeting me with a hug. Then she stepped back and looked me up and down. "Your father used to smoke menthols too when he was your age," she said, giving my father a smirk. I wasn't sure if I was embarrassed that she'd caught me or surprised that Dad used to smoke. He gave me a pat on the shoulder and walked me into the house. We spent that night catching up on what I'd been doing since I was in college. They filled me in on how their business was struggling, but they were keeping their head above water. And then eventually, my dad filled me in on the details of the funeral. They had decided to do a closed casket on both my grandparents. The injuries to my grandfather had apparently been too gruesome for an open casket. They did a closed casket for my grandmother so that people would ask why. The next morning, we attended the funeral. There were only a few people there. My grandparents were in their 80s and had very few friends that were still around. Afterwards, we went back to my parents' house and ate. "Son, your mother and I have talked about it. We need to sell your grandparents' farm. We've neither the time or the money for upkeep. If you can take a week off of school and clean the place up, get it ready to sell, we will give you 25% of whatever we get from the sale." I took a large bite of chicken and chewed it over as I thought. I could call the school and explain the situation, and I could easily catch up later. "Yeah, I can do that. But what do you mean, clean it up? How bad is it?" My mother and father exchanged a worried look before she looked back at the plate. "Just before your grandparents passed, your grandmother called me. She told me that your grandfather had been diagnosed with dementia. Between that and their diminishing health, I suspect that the property's in pretty bad shape." "You haven't been out there?" I asked. It wasn't more than a couple of hours away. I couldn't believe they hadn't visited. Mom replied in a defensive tone. "We've both been working 7 days a week at the shop. We had to let our employees go. Business is not going too well." I nodded and asked what the plan was. "I'll drive you out there tomorrow. You can stay until I pick you up Friday. That gives you 6 days to get everything boxed up. I already ordered the boxes. They'll be delivered tomorrow." The following day, my father drove me up to the old farm. I spent a few weekends there as a kid. The place always had a creepy vibe, but it was fun. I could walk through the corn all day and never reach the end. As we pulled up, I saw a large scarecrow that stood over the corn at the edge of the field. "When did they get that thing?" I asked. Dad didn't answer. Instead, he looked at it out of the corner of his eye. His face contorted into a look of intense worry, maybe even fear? I couldn't tell. As we passed the scarecrow, I looked back. The wind hit it just right for a second, and I could have sworn it turned its head to watch us. About 20 minutes after he dropped me off, I was still wandering through the house, evaluating the countless knickknacks and pictures, trying to decide what should be kept, what should be sold, and what should be tossed. The phone rang and my heart skipped a beat. It's been so long since I've heard a landline ring, I thought it might be a fire alarm. "This is Jim. I'm the delivery guy getting the boxes you ordered, but my GPS doesn't work out here. Can you give me directions?" the man asked as I answered the phone. "Head down the old country road about 5 miles. Make a right at the dirt road," I said, trying to think of any other landmarks I could give this guy. "You'll see a scarecrow. Make a right at that scarecrow." The man thanked me and hung up. About a half hour later, I was washing dishes in the sink and cleaning up the kitchen. My grandmother must have set out lunch before the accident, because there were 2 plates of food on the table. It was so rotten I couldn't even tell what it was anymore. The pungent smell of mold and rotten food was making me gag, so I had to open the kitchen window. I listened to the wind chimes on the porch and found it rather relaxing. I began to wonder how many summer days my grandparents had spent out on the porch, sipping sweet tea and listening to the wind. Over the wind chimes, I heard a scream from the field. I shut off the water and listened closer. I heard the scream again, almost as if someone was howling in pain. I rushed outside and stood at the edge of the corn. My grandfather had waited too long to harvest his crops. The sun had bleached the corn until it was now the color of bone. The stalks waved back and forth in the wind, the dry leaves rustling against each other as they swayed. I heard the noise again and began to walk out into the field towards the noise. "Hello!" I yelled. I passed row after row of maize, looking left and right in the 8 inches of space between each row. And then in the distance, I saw a figure move. I began to run after it. I caught a glimpse of the figure every few seconds as the wind allowed. After a while, I lost sight of it. I ran faster and faster, trying to catch up with whatever it was, and then I ran full speed into the Scarecrow. The straw-filled body did little to dull the impact with the wooden post it was mounted on. I fell onto my back, grabbing my nose as I could feel my palm immediately filling with warm blood. I sat up and felt dizzy, my head throbbing with each beat of my heart. When I finally was able to stand up, I looked up at the Scarecrow. It was probably 7 feet tall, and then another 2 feet off the ground. It was dressed in blue overalls and red flannel. The head was a burlap bag with thick red string stitching its jagged mouth and big black buttons sewn on its eyes. It was topped with a straw hat stitched with the same red string used for the mouth. The thing was pretty intimidating at 6'2". Those crows must have been terrified, I thought to myself. I pinched my nose to stop the bleeding and began to look around. I saw this Scarecrow when we pulled in. There was no way I made it to the road already. I tried to hop up and see over the corn. I couldn't see anything but more corn, all the way to the horizon. As my feet hit the ground, my head felt like it might pop. Thick blood began to flow more quickly from my nose. I pinched my nose and held my head back, facing to the sky to stop the bleeding. Out of the corner of my eye, that's when I saw it. The Scarecrow had turned his head to face me. I turned to face the oversized doll and figured it must have been the wind again. For a second, we made eye contact. The big button eyes seemed to be looking right at me. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was the wind that had moved the head. It was just a bag filled with straw. It was just the wind blowing the stalks, and I imagined it had made them look like a figure running. It had even been the wind that was howling as it passed through the leaves. But still, as I stared at it, I knew it was staring back. The hair on my arm was beginning to rise, making my arms tingle. My heart began to quicken, and then the Scarecrow abruptly lifted its head and looked back over the field, staring. I ran as fast as I could in the opposite direction. I stole short glances over my shoulder as I pushed through the corn. All I could see was a path of broken stalks behind me. Soon I heard a rumbling noise behind me. A truck, I thought. I kept pushing on, my lungs beginning to burn with effort. My foot caught in a shallow irrigation ditch and sent me tumbling onto the dirt driveway. The driver of the truck locked up his brakes, skidding past me as he missed me by an inch. I laid there in the dust for a few seconds. The driver got out of the truck. "What is wrong with you?" he asked. His tone was harsh and angry. I stood up to face him. He was in his mid-40s with a big beard and an even bigger beer belly. "I'm sorry, I lost my footing," I said, looking back into the field, expecting to see the monster coming out to chase me again. The man followed my gaze into the field and then looked back at me. "You high, boy?" he asked seriously. I stopped myself. Telling him I was being chased by a Scarecrow would only reinforce that accusation. "I hit my head pretty hard," I said, placing a hand on my nose again. The driver nodded, then offered me a ride back to the house. "I would have been here earlier if you knew how to give directions. There weren't no Scarecrow at the road," he said. We pulled up to the house and began unloading the boxes he came to deliver. "I'll be back Friday to pick them up once they're full. Your dad booked a storage shed on the other side of town. You have about 200 square feet, so keep that in mind as you pack," he said. He stared into the field. "My daddy was a corn farmer in the next county. He didn't do half as well as you did here. Actually, now that I think about it, I drove past this place last year. I remember they had a rough crop. Do you know what they did different this year?" the driver asked. "No, I'm sorry, I have no idea," I answered. He nodded and spit. "Well, take care of yourself. I'll see you on Friday." With that, he left. I went inside and grabbed a clean shirt. I washed the blood off my hands and face in the bathroom and changed. I tried to shake off the incident with the Scarecrow. I must be more stressed out with the loss of my grandparents than I realized. I needed a distraction and began to pack the office downstairs. I was putting papers in a trash bag when I came across a letter my grandmother had written. "Son, I need some help with your father. The dementia's getting worse. The last 2 days he's been raving like a lunatic. This spring a man came by and offered us a scarecrow as a gift. He said it did wonders for his crops and wanted to pay it forward. Your father told him no at first, thinking the man was a swindler, but he insisted he didn't want anything in return. Your father is now convinced that the scarecrow is the reason we had such a great crop this year, but the scarecrow won't let him harvest it. I left you several voicemails about this and you haven't called me back, so I thought I would write you. Please, come help. I'm worried about your father. Mom." I put the letter down and sat in the office chair. I could dismiss my experience with the scarecrow as just stress or an overreactive imagination, but my grandfather having similar worries about the same scarecrow? What are the odds, I thought to myself. I needed a cigarette. I went outside to the porch and lit one. I took a long drag before exhaling. A cool breeze blew by, bringing the wind chimes to life. I turned around to look at them and see if one would be worth keeping. That's when I saw it. The scarecrow was just 20 feet away in the field. It hung on its post, staring at me. While I was trying to process this, it fell down. Well, more like hopped down. Immediately the post went up and then disappeared into the field. It couldn't be alive, I thought to myself. Seconds later, the scarecrow came out of the corn. It began running across the lawn, carrying the 10-foot post like a Trojan soldier running with a spear. The scarecrow launched the post. It sailed across the yard and missed me by a foot. It took down the wind chimes and impaled the wall behind me. I turned to run inside, but the post was now blocking my entrance. I hopped the rail on the porch and ran towards the old barn. I could hear the scarecrow running behind me, gaining on me, the straw rustling under his overalls and flannel. Once I was inside the barn, I tried to close the door, but it stuck fast from years of neglect. I grabbed the closest thing I could find as a weapon, a pitchfork. The scarecrow entered the room. Its jagged mouth and button eyes now seemed much more menacing as it marched towards me. I rammed the pitchfork into its chest as hard as I could. It pierced deep into its body easily, but it seemed to have no effect. With its left hand, or burlap mitten really, it grabbed my arm. The thing was impossibly strong. It used its right hand to pull the pitchfork out and then turned it towards me. I struggled uselessly against its grip. I desperately searched my pocket for something I could use as a weapon. I took my lighter out and flipped the top open. The flame caught almost instantly. In seconds, the scarecrow was fully engulfed. I let him go and fled into the field. The field was burning in less than an hour. The fire department said it was overly dry because it wasn't harvested on time. They didn't really have any interest in investigating the matter further. My father saw the post stuck in the wall when he picked me up. I knew he recognized it as the scarecrow's post because he didn't ask any questions about how it had gotten thrown through the wall and how the field had burned down. I know on some level he suspected the scarecrow killed his parents. I know on some level that he's grateful I killed it. But I know we will never discuss it because people would think we were. Everyone preaches, love thy neighbor. Everybody opposes the oppression of capitalism, colonialism, and every other ism out there. Countless people who couldn't point Ukraine out on a map are now chanting glory to the Ukraine. An obscene amount of people who didn't care about the British monarchy are now protesting its existence. The moment evil rears its ugly head, the public pays its full attention solely to it, usually leaving the victims as an afterthought. Nobody cares about the victims, because they're faceless statistics, to be flaunted in opposition to the charming and charismatic faces of the darker side of humanity. Again and again I've seen this happen, as the portraits of the things that took my nephew, portraits I've provided the authorities, are displayed all over the news. It's always that monster whose face they show. It's always the stupid nickname they gave the murderer that I keep hearing. The Grey Woman, the Child Cannibal, Fish's granddaughter, and so forth. I've yet to hear anyone mention Arthur Coughlin, or any of the other kids she took. Nobody cares about my nephew. He's a statistic. They found the dead kid decomposing in a ditch with 5 other kids' corpses. They act like it's meant to protect the children and their families from reprisal, or to protect the identities of the minors. It's all BS. There's no ratings, there's no outrage in showing the faces of some nameless victims. They don't matter, and neither do their families. Arthur's mother, my sister Annie, she's dead. She killed herself, unable to cope with the grief of losing her son. She couldn't stand seeing the face of that bitch who took her kid. She couldn't look at herself in the mirror in the last few months of her life because nobody could find, see, or know anything about that woman. She was too mundane, too average to be noticed, too slick to be caught, too monotone to even attract attention. My camera caught her on video, in the act, and yeah, she's just an average Jane Doe you couldn't tell from a crowd of Jane Does. Dark, middle-length hair, average-sized eyes, average head, average body type. Simply unremarkable. It all started about 3 years ago, when Arthur kept complaining to Anne that he'd been seeing someone coming to him at night. A lady is what he called it, describing it to be nothing short of a mundanely dressed human being. He kept telling Anne that whenever she showed up, he wouldn't be able to move for a while in her presence, and would only regain mobility once she faded into darkness. Seeing as how it was my sister's son, she couldn't convince him that there was night terrors or sleep paralysis. The kid was adamant that something was watching him, and that's where I came into the picture. I offered to place cameras all over the house to prove to him that nothing was haunting him at night. After that, we finally quelled his fear of the demonic lady that was disrupting his sleep. I showed him the footage recorded during nights the strange apparition frequented him. At first, he argued the surveillance footage couldn't see ghosts, but eventually he relented and learned to deal with his reoccurring nocturnal inconveniences. The nagging stopped, and everything was fine in the world again. Until one morning, I got a call from my sister, right after finding out I had 10 missed calls from different relatives. Annie was frantic and panicking. Her voice was cracking as she choked out her own tears and was on the verge of losing her battle against exhaustion. Arthur had disappeared. He was nowhere to be found. No one had seen him, not the neighbors, not any acquaintances, nobody, nothing. As if the world had simply swallowed him. Without even thinking, I raced for Annie's, nearly killing myself in my reckless driving to reach my sister. Once I got there, we were both erratic, and my mind and body flew on autopilot. I pulled out everything the cameras had recorded and started searching for whatever had happened to Art the night before. He was in bed by 8:30. Everything was fine and uneventful for the next 5 hours. We all watched in dread and horror as a figure suddenly appeared in frame in his room, as if out of nowhere. A shadow crawling out of nothingness and taking the shape of a person in the recording. I rolled it back multiple times and couldn't find anything or anyone breaking in or entering. She just appeared. The next few minutes became the most haunting moments of my life. Anne, my parents, and I all watched the footage of this figure approaching Art's bed and picking him up before turning and facing the camera, smiling at it and leaving the room, disappearing once again from sight. The way she looked, the way she moved, the way she picked up the kid and left, everything was normal, mundane, unassuming, average to the point of eeriness. Anne completely broke down. She wept and cursed at the screen and wailed for her child to be returned to her. Our parents tried to comfort her, as I did my best to describe what I'd seen to the police. The manhunt for that bitch had begun. Unfortunately, it yielded nothing but a pile of dead bodies. 3 weeks after the disappearance of Art, we found his body, with the remains of 5 other kiddos. All of them were in varying stages of decomposition. The oldest remains were completely skeletal. The face of that monstrosity was everywhere. News, posters, papers, everywhere. She'd infected the entire universe with her presence. Yet, nobody had ever found anything. Not even a trace or a thread leading to her. Absolutely nothing. It's almost as if she never existed. 3 months after Art's death, I became a father. 2 years later, I fathered twins. Anne never recovered. 6 months ago, the last straw broke the camel's back, and Anne took her own life. When I found her, she had a poster of the ghoul paused on her TV screen. She hanged herself, unable to bear seeing the growing legend of this monster again and again, while simultaneously seeing her child's memory fading into obscurity. I didn't have it much easier. All this grief, all this pain, it was taking a toll on me, and I noticed myself developing a habit of drinking a bit too much. If my wife hadn't found me hanging by one hand from our 4th-story apartment, I would probably be dead. It wasn't intentional. I don't think so, at least. I don't remember enough to know. I've toned down my drinking since, and I never drink alone anymore, now that I have kids to raise. No matter how much better my life has gotten, one thing seems to get worse. I think I've conditioned myself to dread the diabolic face of that monotone creature. With every viewing of her portrait, I felt more and more uncomfortable around them. I don't know if it's the paternal instinct or what, but I just came to a point where I can't stand looking at that unremarkable face anymore. It makes my skin crawl, despite its averageness. It all came to a head a few days ago, as I was walking back home from a football game. It was raining, and I was lost in my thoughts when I bumped into someone. We apologized to each other, and only then I saw the person in front of me. My body and soul froze, pins and needles pricked my skin, and a rock formed in my throat, threatening to suffocate me right there. The pounding of my heartbeat echoed in my ears as I watched the world turn still and black. My gaze locked into the mass of humanity in front of me, average in stature and size, the empty yet piercing eyes, violating and welcoming all at once, far more terrifying than any psychopathic stare. The unassuming evil yet innocent smile formed with that mauve, unmatched yet improbable malevolence, the monotonous and monochrome presence of an impossible humanoid shape was obviously inhuman, yet so very human. A stifling sensation of fear paralyzed me as I stared into the non-existent soul of the misanthrope that had taken the life of my nephew, that could have committed an entire genocide with its stare alone. An eerie calm emanated from this human-shaped nightmare and turned my entire body into stone as it smiled at me. Time froze all around us for a second, and it felt like an eternity while my life was being sucked into that black hole that constituted the eyes of this devil that took so much from me. I came face to face with the woman that took so much from me, and found myself being paralyzed by the terrifying shadow of mundanity that surrounded her until she finally retreated from sight back into nothingness. Can you say that again?
Which part?
The date, Dad. The recorder wasn't close enough. I want to make sure we get everything.
Why is it so important that you get every last detail anyway?
Because that's what the doctor said, Dad. The more detail we get, the better he can help you.
Oh, is that right? He's gonna help me, huh? How's he gonna do that exactly? Stuff some more magic pills in my pocket? Maybe sign me up for group therapy? Those are always loads of fun.
No, I think he just wants to get a better understanding of...
He can't help me. Nobody can. Better psychiatrists have tried and failed. You wouldn't believe me anyway. There's no point.
Well, if nothing else, it would help us and the doc to make better decisions regarding you. Look, I promise that I'll listen to everything you have to say. I promise I'll believe you. All right?
Don't say that. You can't promise me something like that. It's all bullshit, and you know it.
All right, fine, fair enough. I promise that I will try to believe, okay? I'll try. Look, forget about the doctor, all right? I want to know what happened that night. Me. I want to know what you were doing in Norway. Why you can never get a good night's sleep. Just tell me. Please.
Fine. It's February 20th, 1943. That's when it all went down. The Axis powers had been almost driven out of Africa, and the Soviets had efficiently turned the tide of war in Eastern Europe. We had the Nazis on the run, for the time being, at least. They were vulnerable, sure, but they still had every capability of rebounding and kicking our asses. As such, the U.S. was particularly interested in taking out any and all Axis weapon development programs.
Weapon development programs? What, like tanks or atomic bombs or...
Exactly. The Allies, specifically, targeted their hard water factories to cripple their production of atomic bombs. But there were other targets. Their so-called wonder weapons project, scattered all over German-occupied territory. Manufacturing depots, chemical weapons labs, bioweapon research centers, etc., etc. That's what I was doing in Norway.
Where in Norway did they send you?
Northern Norway. Far off the mainland lay an island with a Nazi outpost on it. Very little was known about the place at the time regarding its exact purpose and mission. According to our spies inland and the Norwegian rebels, the locals referred to it simply as Fort Ond. They said it was a bad place, that the prisoners who were taken there were never seen again, that the water bordering its shores were barren of all aquatic life and colder than even the most bone-chilling frostbite. Command didn't give a shit about any of that, though. They were only concerned with two things. Why is this installation so far away from German homeland, and why is it so far from mainland Norway? The conclusion they came to was that the Nazis had to be developing some sort of weapon that they didn't want to risk infecting a lot of people with.
So they thought it was a chemical weapons plant?
No, they thought it was a bioweapons lab. Smallpox, anthrax, that kind of stuff. We thought that's what they were doing there, but we didn't know for sure. That's when my unit came in, and where Operation Maelstrom was greenlit.
Maelstrom?
I didn't pick the damn name anyway, so they wanted to keep the operation as covert as possible. Minimum manpower, 1 squad of British SAS, 1 squad of Canadian Commandos, and last but not least, 1 squad of Army Rangers, including yours truly.
What was the purpose of the mission? Just to gather intel, or,
Our first priority was the eradication of the fort's inhabitants and the seizure of any relevant intel. However, we were also prepared for it to turn into a sabotage mission at a moment's notice. Leadership felt pretty confident about the bioweapons theory and didn't want to take any chances with letting the stuff potentially get away, hence the limited manpower. The last thing we wanted was for the Krauts to get spooked by a large invasion force and flee with the samples.
Dad, are you okay?
Yeah, just give me a second.
Really? You gotta do that now, huh?
What? Oh, I'm sorry. Is the smoke gonna bother your little nose that much? Would you prefer I did it somewhere else?
I'd prefer you didn't do it at all, though in a way it's oddly inspiring. Senior citizen, part of the greatest generation, still puffing that shit all these years like it's of no consequence to your health.
To hell with the consequences. Can I continue now, or is this gonna turn into an intervention? 'Cause if so, tell me now so I can save you the time and just leave the room to enjoy the rest of my smoke.
No, please, continue.
We were all flown to Iceland for our briefing. From the moment I arrived, I had no doubt about the operation. The sheer lack of intel we had to go off regarding fort-sized manpower and the exact purpose just seemed odd to me. I remember thinking to myself, I hope there's enough men. When I did so, I caught my friend Weathers looking around too. I could tell he was thinking the same thing. From there, we boarded a British destroyer that took us less than 10 miles from the island. We had to travel the remaining distance on our own in 2 PT boats. I remember just how cold it was that night, how we all subconsciously stood closer to each other than normal in a vain attempt to stay warm, like a bunch of penguins, the lot of us. It was a half-an-hour ride to the island, so we stayed like that for a while, just hunkered up and trying to keep warm as much as we could while we waited for any sign of something. When we were about a mile from the island, we got the sign. We saw it long before we got near the stuff. When we did, we all went silent and watched as we slowed down our boats to make a cautious approach. A thick fog had blanketed the sea around the coastline in all directions for about half a mile. It had a faint red hue to it. Not a deep red, just a faintly visible one. It towered above us nearly 15 feet in the air like a tidal wave and seemingly stared us down. We slowly crept our boats up to it inch by inch until our bows were nearly kissing it. From there, a few of the Canadians on the adjacent boat got some equipment and began prodding the fog for any signs of toxin. We all sat there and waited for them to finish their work. As they did, I took notice of the absolute unnaturalness of it all. It made no movement towards us, nor away from us, yet it billowed and contracted and breathed soothingly in places like you would expect a body of smoke to do. I remember distinctly thinking of it not as a wall, but more like a veil or a curtain, hiding the island from us. A few minutes later, the Canadians signaled over to our boats and gave our commander, Captain Hawks, the thumbs up. The fog wasn't toxic as far as they could tell. Given our mission, though, we couldn't take any chances of it being gas of some kind. Better safe than sorry. So we donned our gas masks and made sure our suits were nice and sealed up. I, in particular, had taken the liberty of duct taping around the gloves and boots to ensure it was tight. Then we started our boats back up and slowly sailed into the unknown. First, I couldn't see anything. The fog was so thick it limited my visibility to just a few feet in front of me, and even less in front of that boat. We couldn't have our lights on for fear of being spotted. When we were out in the open water, this was fine, of course. The moon and stars lit up the surrounding water nicely. But now, there was little to no light penetrating the fog, and we were engulfed in near total darkness. So we just slowly inched our way forward, safely as we could. I just sat there and watched the red vapor hit and dance off my goggles when I searched for any sign of land. For a while, nobody said a word. We all just waited for what seemed like an eternity. The longer we pushed ahead, the tighter the grip on my rifle became as my nerves started up. Finally, one of the Brits broke the silence. I watched him tap the man in front of him and heard him whisper, "You sure this is right?" His sentence was quickly interrupted. We had landed. The entire boat shook wildly as a few of us lost our footing and had to grab the side walls to stay upright. As we did so, I looked around me and noticed the fog gradually growing thinner as we made our approach. Steadily, its opacity diminished. I could begin to see shapes through the veil. The crunching noises ceased a few seconds later, and with them, so did the fog from my line of sight. It was still there, but it was thinner and lower to the ground than it was on the open sea. It only came up to our knees from that point on, which meant I could finally see our objective, the island. It was a mess of scattered jagged rocks and hills, caverns and towering cliffs that seemed to scatter in all directions, like a porcupine made of stone. At its center, one giant hill stood out. I followed it from the base to the peak with my eyes, and at its peak there was a door. That was it. No trace of human life, no pathways, no trenches, no buildings of any kind. Nothing that would suggest any sort of operation that we were undertaking on the island. There were a few guard towers, of course. We knew at least that much from our aerial photos, but we had chosen our landing site specifically to be in a blind spot they wouldn't see us from. That was it, though. Apart from the door that stuck out amidst the terrain, looking utterly unnatural in the distance, there was no sign of life. No buzzing insects, no splashing fish, no chirping birds, not even the wind itself seemed to bow before the island's authority and ceased completely. No life whatsoever. I thought back to when my first encounter of the fog and just how right I was in my thought process. We truly had crossed a veil of some kind. Captain Hawks gave the hand signals. We all filed out and patrolled inland as fast as we could to a nearby cave. The Norwegians were waiting for us there.
The Norwegians? Were they the ones who gave you the fort's intel to begin with?
The very same. Adding them to our roster brought our total to 35 men.
Dad, it's okay. Take your time.
We headed into the cave and linked up with the Norwegians, who sat steadfast in a defensive position. One of them stood up as soon as we breached the darkness of the cavern and swung his gun over in our direction, shouting at us, presumably to lower our weapons, before quickly lowering his own to make a half-hearted apology. Hawks was livid. He stormed over to the man with one forceful strike of his fist and sent the poor Norwegian hurtling towards the ground. "You some kind of fucking moron, kid? I was this close to blowing your goddamn head off." The commander of the Norwegians rushed over to stand between the two of them. "Please forgive us, sir. We've been on the edge since we arrived a few days ago. It was an honest mistake." He helped his fallen soldier back to his feet and ordered him to the back of the cave to tend to his face. Afterwards, he and Hawks stared at each other for a few seconds in silence while we all just waited to see who would speak. The leader of the Norwegians spoke first. "Something is wrong, very wrong. Our intel is severely off," he said. "None of the guard towers have occupants, and we haven't seen Nazi soldiers patrolling the island in 3 days. We've been spying on the island for weeks now, as best we could. The entire time we did so, the soldiers were patrolling the shores, manning the towers and watching the coastlines. But 3 days ago, this fog emerged, obscures our vision, and made it nearly impossible to see anything on the island. Since we arrived, we've done multiple sweeps and scouting runs along the island's surface before you arrived. No one is here, American, not a soul. It's like they just vanished, at least from the island's surface." I looked back over at McKinley, who did the same. We exchanged confused looks at one another before looking back at the two leaders, who were now talking too quietly for anyone to hear. Finally, Hawks turned to face us and gave a deep sigh. "We think the Nazis have locked themselves away in the fort's cave system and interior. According to our good buddies here, the island's surface is safe. Let's hope they're right. Conduct final checks on all your equipment, then form up by the cave entrance. We're going in." So we got into formation and made our way up the rough terrain to the door. It was the one I had spotted when we had landed. As far as we could tell, it was the only entrance to the interior of the fort. The absence was nerve-wracking. The cold, wet staircase that led up to the fort entrance proved difficult to scale with all my equipment, which was made all the more dangerous, of course, by the fog. With it clinging about knee level on every surface of the island, made it damn near impossible to see where you were stepping, so we just slowly tiptoed our way up to the door as best we could. All the while, nobody uttered a word. So quiet I could hear my own heartbeat throbbing in my ears. Eventually, we reached the top of the stairs. The door itself was monolithic.
Monolithic, huh? What, like ancient?
Oh yeah, stood nearly 9 feet tall and looked like it was made out of bronze or copper. I don't know, some kind of faintly orange metal. It was covered in strange engravings that could only be described as hieroglyphics. They weren't, of course, but that was the only comparison I'd been able to find since that day. And believe me, I've tried. I looked through every damn book I could think of. Nothing comes close to the symbols and markings I saw engraved on that door. It was like a foreign language of some kind. Didn't look like it was written or chipped away from the door by an expert's hand, so much as it looked like it was slashed or cut, like something had hacked its way in with claws or teeth to create the strange writing. It didn't look like a human hand had done it neither. Looking up at the door, I felt like an explorer. like I'd found something lost to mankind for millennia, and I was rediscovering it. Only I didn't want to be the person to discover this. At that moment, I wasn't sure I wanted to be aware that this place existed, let alone be the one to have to open that damn door and walk into God knew what. We readied our explosives, expecting to have to breach our way in. To our surprise, though, the wooden beam that was attached to the door lifted. The monolith opened slightly, and with it came a stench of utter and all-devouring rot, like pus and spoiled milk, bile and sulfur, all fused into one unholy concoction that assaulted my nostrils and instantly forced tears down my cheeks. First I panicked, believing my mask wasn't secure, tight enough, and I was inhaling a toxin of some kind. But when I looked up and saw that all my team members were doing the same, our masks all working fine, we couldn't have all had potential leaks, right? The smell was truly just that powerful. The door had only given way and opened a tiny bit. A front man quickly had to ask for help as the door was too heavy to heave by himself. 4 men, including me, pushed with all our mights and then quickly ran out of the way as soon as the door was completely open, so the guys behind us could aim down that opening. When they did, they didn't see much. Their flashlights shined straight into a wall, angling down and away from us. What lay before us was another staircase, carved out of the very stone of the mountain itself. The fog clung low to the ground past the doorway, only coming up to about ankle height, but it still obscured the steps all the same. We stared down the doorway, waiting for orders to advance, but Hawk said nothing. He just stood there with his gun trained ahead and his other hand held up, silently telling us to wait. I suspected he was listening, waiting to hear any communication from us opening the heavy door, for any sign of enemies. There were none, however. Not a sound could be heard from down the staircase, just like everywhere else so far. Goff leaned over to me and tapped me on the shoulder. "Something's not right, man," he whispered. I did not respond. I didn't feel I needed to. Everyone was already thinking the same thing anyway. No point in vocalizing it, especially not when I think we could all see what Hawks was thinking. I watched a chill run up his spine that shook his held-up hand and rifle slightly in place. I'd never seen him like that before. He steadied himself, and with a low, reassuring grunt, which was probably more for his benefit than ours, he gave the order, "File in." So we went. We descended for about 20 feet. The staircase itself was dark, but we could see light at the bottom. The sight of light was a relief. Instantly, I felt a tiny shred of my anxiety wither away as my instincts took hold. I readied myself for any Germans that might be waiting for us at the bottom. There were no Germans, though. None left anywhere. None alive. When I reached the bottom of the staircase, the scene laid out before me like something you'd see in a crime scene. It was a big square room illuminated by gas lanterns in its center. The door directly ahead of us led to an opening in the floor with a ladder hooked to it. 2 doorways on our left and right, like a plus sign or a cross. Various crates and workstation desks lay toppled over, all facing the direction of the newly discovered staircase, like sentry posts. They all faced towards the same point, scattered throughout the room where the Nazis, half sunken in the fog and slightly obscured by it, draped over the crates, leaning up against the walls, crumpled up like soda cans in the corners. There were at least a dozen of them. Their blood pooled beneath their feet, but I hardly noticed it through the tinted fog. I took a step forward, and that's when I heard the familiar jingling of empty bullet casings beneath my feet. Subsequently, Bullet holes could be seen in nearly every square inch of the wall in front of us. "Jesus Christ!" Weathers shouted as we entered the room, prompting Hawks to hold up his hand and signal for us to shut up. "Whoever the fuck did this might still be here. Stay frosty," he muttered sternly to us. "Fan out. Check the room on our flanks," he commanded via hand signals. Half our men went to the room on the right, while the remaining went left. I, along with 3 others, stood guard in the lit room, kept our guns trained on the ladder ahead of us. As I knelt behind a crate to take a better defensive position, I noticed one of the Nazis was laying face down in a puddle of his own blood. I kept my rifle trained ahead as I slowly reached over and heaved on his shoulder, forcing him to roll onto his back. He had a look of utter terror frozen on his face, with eyes wide open and mouth agape. He bore cuts and large slash marks up his chest and torso, which caused his entrails to expose themselves slightly. I looked around the room at the other men to verify, and sure enough, the ones who were submerged in the fog shared similar wounds of size and volume. The fuck happened here? I thought to myself. That thought was quickly overtaken by a doubly terrifying realization. I looked at the bullet holes directly ahead of me and thought, whatever the hell happened here, I'm standing in the same place they were. After a few tense moments of sitting with that realization, the squad checking the right room emerged, holding a few books and folders. They bore similar engravings to the ones seen on the door upon our arrival, and were bound in leather so ancient that it looked like the faintest breeze would disintegrate them if they weren't careful. They showed it to Hawks, who took one of the books and began sifting through the pages. At first he scanned the pages carefully and thoroughly, but he quickly thereafter began to shuffle through them frantically and impatiently, before reaching back and shoving it into his pack. Right about that time, the squad from the left room emerged. A British soldier approached and said, "Just more dead krauts, sir. There's something. We found cages big enough to fit a human in. There were bodies in them, but they weren't German civilians," the Norwegian team leader interrupted. "These were fucking animals." Hawks looked like he was getting ready to say something, but he didn't get the chance. All conversation and thoughts were stopped when the sound of screaming could be heard down the ladder. With one uniform motion, all remaining men turned their guns to face the same direction as I already was. We waited for what felt like an eternity for a head to come bobbing up in the opening of the floor, for the sound of footsteps, for any sign of enemies. Nothing came. After a few minutes or so, Hawks gave the order. We were going down there. I really didn't want to do this anymore.
Dad, please, you can do it. Just take a second, okay?
The smell, Patrick.
What about it?
I can't get it out of my nose. It's been 60 goddamn years since then, and I can't get it out of my nose. God, by the time we reached the bottom, Garf had already vomited. I had to fucking cover him while he did it. Good thing I hadn't eaten anything before the briefing, else I would have too. When we reached the bottom, there was nobody, just like the rest of the island. No signs of life.
What did you see at the bottom of the ladder?
Well, it was a large cavern-like room with multiple passageways that branched off in all directions, but at its center was a well, made out of the same stone as the mountain. It somehow looked older, more ancient, more monolithic. Along its rim were the same damn etchings and carvings as the door. Upon closer examination, we saw what the source of the fog was that had plagued us since our arrival. We watched it for a while and observed the fog billowing up and out and over the top, well, in all directions at a constant, unnatural rate. Couldn't believe that such a tiny source could have produced as much as we'd seen up to that point. I couldn't believe that the colossal wall that we'd encountered upon our arrival originated from such a minuscule well deep in the mountain. As we spread out to cover the other passageways, I approached it and leaned over. Patrick, the smell was so strong that I was thrown back onto my hands and knees almost immediately from the stomach contractions. It was the source of the fog, of the smell, of everything.
What was in the well?
Blood. The whole fucking thing was full of blood. More blood than I'd ever seen in my life. More than the room upstairs. More than any other mission I'd ever seen on. And it was fresh. It boiled gently. It seemed to move on its own as though it were alive and aware of our presence in the room. And when I gazed upon it, the attack on my nose and stomach seemed like one of calculation, as though a cobra had spat in my face for daring to get too close. I wasn't allowed even a second to recover from the stench, however. That exact moment we heard more screams. Seemingly every passage in the cavern emitted what I can only describe as a wail of anguish, like the flesh was being peeled off somebody's forearm and pouring salt back into the wound at the same time. They pierced all our ears like razor blades and made me wince so hard I almost forgot about my stomach pain. How big is this place? I thought to myself. What the hell could be happening just down those tunnels? Fuck this, Hawk said. Start planting charges. We are getting out of this place as soon as possible. It was music to all our ears. One of the soldiers came over to check on me and the rest as we began to start laying charges. There was nothing professional about our process. We were just laying them out as fast as we could so that we could get the hell out of that stenched place and back to the boats. The screams continued the entire time we worked.
Were they getting closer?
I don't know. They sounded like they were coming from every passage all at once, but it was hard to tell. We had a man eyeing down every doorway just in case, though. Didn't matter. We should have been watching the walls. As I struggled to compose myself to get back to my feet, I had a front row seat for what was about to happen. Goff, the poor bastard, he was doing his rounds, laying his charges along the floor, around the well. I wanted to speak up, to tell him not to get too close, but I was still sucking in air through my teeth and couldn't get the words out. All I could do was hold my hand out to him and grunt. He turned to face me. "You gonna make it?" was the last thing I heard him say. At that very moment, an arm shot out of the well behind him, locked itself around his neck, and pulled him in head first. The arm was inhumanly long, more like a tentacle than an arm, but its form was undeniably human. It wrapped itself around his neck and dug its fingers into the side of his face as it dragged him deeper and deeper down. I watched him thrash around and kick his legs wildly in vain as he attempted to get free, spraying torrents of blood in all directions around him. He was already halfway submerged by the time our men got a hold of his feet. When they did so, another hand shot out of the wall and locked itself around Goff's waist, now pulling him in faster. I could hear gurgling and see bubbles of air making their way to the well's surface. Poor bastard was drowning in that putrid liquid. The men pulled with all their might, but it didn't slow down his descent in any noticeable way. They heaved and barked orders to the others like rabid dogs, desperate to save our comrades, but no help came. We were alone with the incomprehensible, and it was winning. The rest of us simply stood by dumbfounded and watched as he was forcibly dragged into the well, inch by inch. When it was clear that the men could do nothing more, they let go and took a few steps back. Their entire arms were covered in blood to the elbow. For a moment, nothing happened. Nothing said a word, moved a muscle, did anything. We all just faced the wall and tried our best to process what had just happened. Didn't last long. The well began to gurgle and bubble as though it were digesting my friend. It began to overflow, slow and thick crimson liquid oozing over the top of the well and onto the cold stone floor beneath, making its way towards us. I was the first to move. I stood up and began to slowly step backwards towards the ladder. That's when the massacre began. In an instant, all hell erupted around us. The same arms that had dragged my friend to a then unknown fate sprang out of the walls around us as the island became alive and began to frantically swing around, searching for bodies to claim. A few of them found their mark and pulled some of the men towards the walls, wrapping themselves around their necks and locking them in place and suffocating them. Any sense of composure our toughest men had remaining left their bodies that very moment, and we all made a mad dash for the ladder. The room was only dimly lit by all our flashlights, though. When we broke our formation and began to run, our visibility became significantly limited. Bodies ran into each other, and men began slipping on blood that now reached for their feet. The fog had all begun rising in intensity at a startling rate, and was now almost as thick and copious as it was out on the sea. This made it all the more hard to tell what exactly was happening, and before I knew it, I was knocked onto my ass by one of the Canadians as he ran straight into me. The blood rose higher and higher at an inconceivably fast rate. It was halfway up my knees by the time I regained my footing. When I did, I felt a sudden rush of movement brush past my leg. That's when I saw it. There were shapes moving in the blood, large, serpentine-like shapes that slithered all around us and began to quickly encircle my team. Like sharks, they enveloped us, poised for the kill. They seemed to be probing us for weaknesses, waiting for the exact right moment to strike and take as many of us down as they could. I wasn't gonna let them get me. My body moved independent of my paralysis psyche as I sprinted for the ladder and reached as high as I could to escape the cavern. However, the ladder was barely wide enough to fit one man on it. It was made of wood and was not meant to support the weight of more than a couple of men at a time. I remember just how careful we had to scale it just to get down to the cursed room in the first place. I worried it was going to give way any second, and I'd be stranded in that room with those things, with the well. I felt it crack and buckle beneath me as more men than intended all tried to climb it at once. I pushed into the men above me just as the person did below me, all in a desperate race to escape. Just when I was sure all was lost and I'd never make it out, I reached the top and rolled onto my back. As I did, I heard a loud snapping sound, followed by 8 loud splashes hitting the liquid below. I rolled over and shined my flashlight down the hole to look at the scene and try to help some of the men escape what would now become a tomb. It was no use, though. It was 20 feet down. I couldn't reach any of them. Weathers, McKinney, they stared up at me and shouted for help, but what was I supposed to do? The blood had risen to above their waistbands by that point, and there was more of those fucking things circling them. They climbed over one another in a desperate attempt to get enough height to reach the exit, but I was nowhere near enough. I felt so helpless. I watched the mysterious shapes and figures in the blood creep up to them from behind. Then, as if coordinated, in an instant, they pounced and dragged 3 men under the murky depths at once. In that split second, when they had leapt from the pool to attack the men, I caught only the faintest glimpse of their true form. They were like eels or leeches with spider legs and beaks. Something of that family, but it's still not an accurate comparison. They were truly otherworldly, inhuman, even to creation itself. They were abominations that I'm glad they were obscured by the fog, as to have glanced upon them in all their unholiness would have been too much for me at that moment. They yanked the men down into that ocean of blood. As they did so, the men thrashed around chaotically and knocked more men over, making the already futile pyramid of terrified men all the more pitiful. That's when I noticed the 3 that were taken by those serpents were being dragged towards the well. They were being dragged to the well so it could devour them, just like Goff had been taken away to that unspeakable fate. I looked at the edge of the room to search for the first victim of the attack, the one who had been forcibly dragged towards the well by the arm. When I found them, I felt my stomach churn once again. Their bodies were halfway into the cavern walls. Their arms were dragging the men head first into the island itself to be consumed. It was as though the island was alive, the well was alive, and it wanted us dead. The remaining few screamed and pleaded and begged for me to help them. All I could do was stare down at the chaos before me and watch. I was ripped out of my comatose state by a firm hand on my shoulder. It was Hawks. "Get up. We gotta get out of here." He picked me up by the back of my shirt and dragged me to my feet, pushing me up the staircase. I didn't have a plan. I just ran. My body was truly on autopilot. I couldn't think of anything other than the men we were leaving behind, and the looks I saw on the faces of those men as they screamed at me for help. The fog had now completely engulfed the inside of the fort, and I struggled to maintain my footing as I ran as fast as I could through the first chamber and up the staircase. As we exited the main door, I was stopped dead in my tracks. I heard gunshots behind me. By God, they were still alive. They were still fighting to get out, and I was abandoning them. Hawks once again yanked me by the back of the shirt as he went past, encouraging me onward. "There's nothing we can do for 'em. We gotta get to the boats now." And with that, he ran off ahead of me through the red smoke. Every fiber of my being compelled me to go back, but my body refused to obey. I just stood there trembling, white knuckles grasping my rifle as I struggled to make a choice. After a few agonizing seconds of contemplation, I followed after Hawks and made my way to the boat, to freedom. As we sped away from the island, I was able to slowly creep back to the real world mentally and finally take note of my surroundings. It was me, Hawks, and 3 other British troops. Only 5 men had made it out. None of us said a word. We all just kept to ourselves and stared off into space, doing our best to process what had happened. I looked back at Fort Ond one last time before it disappeared over the horizon. The fog had grown larger now, redder, hungrier. When we got back to the destroyer, we told command everything that we had seen and what had happened. They didn't believe a word of it. I can't really say as I blame them. We must have sounded insane. Showing up, missing 30 men, covered head to toe in blood, rambling about a mysterious well, our friends being dragged away by an unknown creature to an unknown fate, ancient bronze doors and slaughtered Nazi soldiers. They told us that we had most likely been exposed to nerve gas, that the base was being classified as a possible chemical weapons lab, and that when we inhaled the fog, maybe we were subjected to hallucinations. But we were sealed up head to toe. We stood up for ourselves as best we could. We all corroborated each other's stories and validated each other's testimonies. We swore up and down till we were blue in the face that the island was not what they thought it was, that our friends had been killed by an unknown force, and that we had to destroy the fort. They just stared at us like we were a pack of lunatics. They had made up their minds about what had happened to us on the island. Any attempts made by any of us to get the record straight only served to make us look even more insane. I turned to one of the admirals and spoke up one last time. I had to know something before they turned us away. Please tell me you guys are gonna level that place. He stared at me for a few tense seconds before simply saying, "We'll handle it." And with that, it was over. All the remaining members of Operation Maelstrom were discharged the next day, deemed medically unfit to continue service. Each of us was briefed individually on the events of that night, and I was told not to utter a word to anyone about the events of Operation Maelstrom, or to disclose the fort's location to anyone. The colonel who was briefing me told me, "For the record, I believe there's at least a little truth to what you told us. But regardless, you and the survivors are a liability now, unstable and erratic. We can't risk putting any of you onto another operation, not after what happened to you. Or at least, not after what you think happened to you. I'm sorry, but this is for your own good." I was put on a plane the next day and sent home. That's it. You don't believe a word of what I just said to you, do you?
Well, no, not all of it. I mean, I want to, but it's a little much to
I know how it sounds. You think I don't hear myself saying this shit to you? I know how it must sound, but it's true, son. The well is real. What happened to me was real.
Look, I'm sure it must have felt that way, Dad, but you have to...
You don't believe a word of it. Nobody does. You, the doctors, every other person I've confided in just thinks I'm a lunatic who imagined all of this. I see the way you're looking at me, like I'm just a poor old man who's losing his mind. I know what I saw. I know what I went through. You weren't there.
I know I wasn't. I'm not saying I was, Dad, but come on, work with me. Isn't it possible it was a nerve agent or something? How the hell would you know it wasn't?
'Cause we all saw the same damn thing. All the survivors of Maelstrom gave the exact same testimony upon our return. Everything from our encounter with the fog to our return to the ship was synced up perfectly. What do you think, we all hallucinated the same thing?
No, I just think maybe...
You know, they took the books that Captain Hawks acquired. Oh yeah, they made sure we kept nothing from our mission, stripped us bare right after we returned to the ship, but told me what he saw in those pages. More of those strange symbols, those hieroglyphics of unknown origin, the mention of Torzur Hole, some kind of portal to hell or somewhere worse or God knows where. You want to know why I can't sleep at night, Patrick? The real reason is 'cause I know it's still there. We'll handle it, they said. Yeah, like hell they did. They probably just set up shop themselves and tried finishing what the Kraut started. Or maybe not. Maybe they heard our warnings and listened to us. Maybe they shelled the place into oblivion and actually did handle it. But I'll never know, son. I'll never get my closure on the events of what happened that night. I'll never get to know with 100% certainty that the well has been sealed and that whatever lies in the depths of Fort Ond can't get me anymore.
Let's just take some deep breaths, okay? Why don't you just calm down and...
This was a waste of time. It always is with people like you.
Dad, come on, please.
We're done here. Turn that damn thing off and get...
The tape ends there. I couldn't find any additional tapes in my father's belongings, so for the time being, that's where the story ends. I didn't know my grandpa too well. He died when I was 12 and was reclusive. Sadly, this tape is one of the only glimpses I've gotten into his life. I don't know what to believe. It's easy to write him off as crazy or the victim of a gas attack, but the fear I heard on that tape sounded way too real. It's gotta mean something, right? If nothing else, the torment he endured was real, and maybe that's all that matters. Or maybe, just maybe, he's right. Maybe Fort On still stands, exactly as he described, hidden somewhere behind the veil of fog.